Thank you. So my name's Dani. I am a fund manager at AXA, and I'm responsible there for two sets of funds. One is the health fund, and the other is a longevity economy focused fund. I'm curious to take a straw poll of how we should pronounce longevity or longevity. We've had trouble in other markets. Germany, for example, don't do longevity, they do longevity, but there you go. Now, AXA are very much long-term active managers. We have approximately 750 billion assets under management, and about 10% of that is in active equities, and that's where I sit within Framlington. Now, the job of a fund manager, I'm sure you'll have your own views, but the job of a fund manager at AXA is to identify 40 to 60 stock portfolios that we think can outperform the market over a 5-10 year time frame. And the way we do that is to focus on companies which have significant revenue growth and have exposure critically to long-term themes. And these themes we call the evolving economy. And obviously, today, my focus will be on aging and lifestyle, but these are multi-decade themes that we believe have the capacity to grow at least 10% per annum for 10, 20, 30 years. And these aren't revolutionary themes. In fact, they will move at different paces over the next 10, 20 years, but they all impact society today, they will in the future, and they're all investable today. And so, whether we take transitioning societies, which is all about the growing middle class, whether it be in emerging markets in Asia, or clean technology, dealing with aspects around climate change, these are all areas where we believe we can find opportunities to invest and deliver attractive returns. And so I'm now going to touch upon aging and lifestyle, and we're going to talk about how that's affecting the way we live, the way we consume, and the way we need to plan our futures. But perhaps also it's worth sort of touching on what do we mean when we talk about evolving versus an old economy. And really in that regard, we're talking about maybe take high street retail, and we've all obviously been witness to the virtues of e-commerce, the simplicity and the pace with which we can just go out and order whatever our hearts desire. We don't have to spend an hour and a half dragging our children through a supermarket to do our weekly shop. These are trends that are only going to continue to evolve. And when we look at how these evolving economy themes versus these old economy and look at their performance, we do see already a big delta in that performance. And we think we're really at the beginning of that transition from this old to new evolving economy. And so this isn't, pie in the sky, cozy and quaint AXA thinking that we're putting out into the ether and not doing anything about it. We have a whole product range addressing these themes, and today we have approximately 5 billion sterling dedicated to all of these strategies in totality. So it's something where AXA fervently and passionately believes in, and one where we are clearly investing. Now, onto today's subject, and I'm going to steal a little bit from Andrew, who, along with Jim, obviously are the co-founders of the Longevity Forum. But it is still, and it still staggers me today, that the majority of children born in developed countries can expect to live to over 100. We have a better than 50% chance of living to 100, and those numbers continue to go higher. And you'll have heard from Mike and others about every 10 years we've typically added about 2 to 2.5 years to human lifespan, and so that continues. There are obviously peaks and plateaus along the way, but the trend does seem to be in that direction. And essentially, we've got very good at not dying. It really is a human triumph. I mean, only I was going to say the British, but it's a universal phenomenon where we can take a negative out of a positive. We've got a situation where a 75-year-old today has the same mortality of a 65-year-old who was born, in the 1960s. So it's something that we should be celebrating, and it's not something that we should necessarily frown and fret about. I really feel there needs to be a bit more discussion around the longevity dividend, and hopefully that's where I fit in a little bit. Now, 2018 was a momentous year, not least because my beloved Man United managed to finish out the Champions League places. But it was a year when we reached peak youth. So the number of people over the age of 65 now outnumbers the number of people under the age of 5. And arguably this marks the start, and I don't want to be too grandiose, but the start of probably this century's greatest political, economic and societal transformation. Because quite simply not enough babies are being born. And it seems a bit odd to say something along those lines and then switch to someone like Toys R Us, which I'm sure many of you will know obviously went bankrupt. And there was an article actually in the Washington Post at the time of its bankruptcy talking about the reasons for why it failed. And one of the reasons that the journalist picked out was essentially that the most important customer for Toys R Us there wasn't a large growth of, as in children aged between 0 and 11. And the journalist at the end of this article finished with what was building to a crescendo of we can't have economic growth without population growth. And I sort of went, that's kind of true because we do have population growth. It's just at the wrong end from a Toys R Us perspective. We have plenty of population growth and it's all in this population of people over the age of 60. So we should note down this sort of momentous year and how that's affecting companies. Maybe to put it into some more sort of numerical aspects, the over 60 population is forecast to grow, and this is UN data, 6 times faster than the under 60 population. And I've picked a rather arbitrary point, 60, but just to try and sort of strengthen my point. And then I've touched on the US, and looked at the over 80 population. And the over 80 population in the US is actually going to grow 27 times faster than the under 60s. And I make that point, one, hopefully for dramatic effect, but two, importantly, because there's a very big difference between someone who's 60 and someone who's 80 in terms of their wants, needs and desires. And that really is then going to create opportunities for companies who recognise that to come up with products and solutions that address the needs and wants and desires of those different age categories. And it really is a global phenomenon. If we took the UK, about a quarter of the population in the UK today are over the age of 60. In about 30 years' time nearly, 2050, that will be almost 40%. And it's a trend that you will see repeat itself across Europe, whether it be France, Germany, Italy, Spain. Anywhere from 40 to 50% of their populations will be over the age of 60 by the year 2050. It's 6 times the UK population that we can expect in terms of incremental people over the age of 60. Or if we take the archetypical reference country, 3 times the population of Japan. So, this is truly global. In fact, 80% of the world's ageing is predicted to happen in the Asia-Pacific region, but obviously we're here in the UK and perhaps we're dealing with this a little bit more tangibly in our own market. I mentioned earlier about it being a societal issue and an economic issue, but it also is clearly a political issue. And we're seeing that manifest itself in many regions of the world. And I'm going to pick on China, because China historically has been viewed as this great, huge labour force, cheap labour force. And actually, China's under 60 population is now actually forecast to decline over the next 20, 30 years. And will actually undergo probably the most rapid pace of ageing that we'll have seen and witnessed. By 2050, the UN expect a quarter of the world's over 60s will be in China. That's 500 million people. And China need to do something about that, and you've seen that very candidly by a change in their one-child policy. That's a recognition that they're going to suffer population decline of some description. But it's unfortunately a little bit too late for that. We also see that in maybe less obvious places like Russia. There was a huge public backlash around Putin's attempts to raise the retirement age in Russia. And we've seen obviously in the UK the increasing in retirement ages. And we also seen the advent of auto-enrollment, that wonderful thing where we all have to absolutely save in terms of our pensions. So it's having an impact. across many different channels. But I think one of the things that people most have taken not enough time to think through is around how it's going to affect how we live. Because long gone are the days when you could go off to university, have a job for life maybe, and then retire at 65 and go on many a cruise and sail off into the sunset. If we're going to live potentially to 100, or our children are going to live to 100, they're going to have to plan for a multiple stage life. And I'm clearly referencing some fine work here from Linda Grattan and Andrew Scott. But I think it's really important to recognise that we're going to have a much longer middle, much longer middle. And therefore, education will play an increasingly important role in terms of having to recreate ourselves rather than just necessarily having recreation. And I think it's absolutely imperative that when we think about how we will, over time, we'll have to step out of the workforce either because our job has become obsolete and we need to retrain, or quite simply you didn't plan on being a lawyer for the next 60 years, or you didn't want to be an accountant for 50 years, or whatever that job is, it's not a career for life anymore. We're clearly seeing, will the black cab still exist in the future with Uber and self-driving cars? There is going to be massive technological change, and we're going to undergo that through a longer period, and we have to plan and prepare for that. And so one of the things that we look at from an investment standpoint is education, but in particular mature education or graduate education. And I've picked out 3 different companies here, all of which address different aspects of longevity. So Strategic Education, they are a US adult education company, and what they're essentially addressing is the fact that why does it take 4 years to acquire a degree? Maybe you've already received a degree and then you've worked in industry for many years, and maybe you've accumulated a huge skill set that maybe isn't evidenced per se by a degree in and of itself, but maybe you're as a way of getting a speeded up accreditation. They're also offering degrees at work. So corporates recognize that if you want to retain your employees and keep them loyal, it might not be possible, though, to keep them in their role for the duration of their careers, and therefore retraining and reskilling them for their next phase of their careers is becoming essential. And so they offer those types of solutions. The flip side of that would be someone like Adtalem. Adtalem is one of the largest medical education companies, providing companies in the US, essentially training for nurses and doctors and veterinarians. And the US is, as well as being one of the most expensive places in terms of providing care and healthcare in the world, we also have obviously a significant labour challenge in terms of delivering that care. And so in the US, approximately 50% of their nurses are over the age of 50, and there are many surveys that show that a significant portion of those nurses plan to retire in the next 3 to 5 years, and that is then translating into a major shortfall in terms of physicians and nurses that are going to be able to deliver the care to what will be an increasingly aged population that will be suffering from more and more morbidities. So Adtalem is part of the answer to that. It's not necessarily the be-all and end-all, but it just gives you an example of there are going to be industries that are affected by longevity, and we need to think about how we're going to address that. The final one is an interesting one, given it's the UK, closer to home, St James's Place, I'm sure some of you are familiar with in terms of wealth management. I don't want to talk about them as a wealth manager, although that clearly is an area of investment from a longevity standpoint. But what's interesting from St James's Place perspective is there's a real issue with the age of independent financial advisors in the UK. And in fact, the chances are by the time that you're ready to retire, the IFA that you had been building your portfolio with or investment portfolio with will have already retired as well. And so the time when you need them the most, they'll have actually disappeared. And St James's Place realised that the biggest challenge for them in terms of their growth is the number of new advisors that they can bring in and make part of their company. And so what they've actually done is set up their own St James's Place Academy, where they actually train people to become their next set of advisors. And what's interesting about this academy is the average age of their graduate was 38. And to give you an idea of just how a significant decision that is for that person, these are people who are already in jobs and are essentially committing to an 18-month, possibly as long as 2-year education program to get trained and qualified as an advisor. So it's a pretty big leap on the behalf of the individual, but that clearly is an opportunity for people who go, well, you know what, I've been working for 20 years in sales and marketing, maybe I wanted to do something else, I think I could be good at that, and they make that transition and make that commitment to a new role. You'll have heard obviously earlier from Nir when talking about Healthspan, and I'm going to steal a great quote that I heard last year from John F. Kennedy, which was that it's not enough that we add new years to life, but we need to add new life to those years. And you know, he was well ahead of his time in many ways, but I particularly do like that quote. And this is a study that was from the Oxford Institute of Population Ageing, and actually the learnings from this, which I'll briefly talk you through, actually has driven another response from a corporate that you'll be more familiar with. And some of you may remember Jessica Ennis and a little sausage dog and the Vitality insurance brand. Anyone remember that? So there's a connection here. So whilst we've talked about life expectancy increasing, what hasn't kept pace with life expectancy is healthy life expectancy. And essentially, the Oxford Institute came up with this sort of acronym, 3-4-50. So there are 3 lifestyle choices: drinking, excessive eating and smoking, that drive 4 chronic conditions that account for 50% of the deaths in the world today. And the green bar is the impact that it has on your healthy life expectancy, and the blue bar is the impact it will have on your life expectancy itself. And so whilst drinking or smoking has a more or less equal impact upon your healthy life expectancy and life expectancy itself, obesity is a real issue and challenge, because whilst you'll only reduce your life potentially by just over a year, your healthy life is reduced by almost 6 years. So that's same length of life essentially that you would have, but you're sicker for longer periods of that life. And you know, one thing we don't want to do obviously is live an extra 20, 30 years and not have a particularly high quality of life because we're bedridden or on a ventilator or something because of poor health. I've been in meetings where I've shown them this slide, and one clever chap pointed out to me that it turns out the best thing to do if you're going to pick a vice is to drink alcohol. He thought because it only reduced your life by 3 years and your healthy life by a similar amount. I'm not advocating that at all, although you can take from that if you wish. What's interesting though is 3-4-50 then became very much part of the corporate mantra for a South African insurer called Discovery Limited. And Discovery then came up with and out-licensed that sort of proposal to Vitality, and it's further gone to the likes of AIA in Asia. And essentially, where you get incented for good behaviours. You get rewarded with if you did 1,000 steps, you can have a free Starbucks coffee. If you go to the gym, you get a discounted gym membership. And as long as you document this and log this. And the idea being, obviously, if you have a healthier cohort of policyholders, then Discovery will end up, insuring you for a certain amount. Maybe they'll charge you a lower premium, but they're hoping, obviously, in the long term, that will result in lower payouts for them in the future. So these are all happening today and impacting upon corporate decision making. Now, you'll have heard earlier about healthcare spending and how it's surging. And in fact, if you looked at US healthcare as a proportion of GDP, it's about 17-18% today. And in fact, their own budget office is predicting it will get to 20% of GDP, which is just quite staggering. And so I thought I'd put those numbers on a page. This is US data. So essentially, at the age of 65, our spending on healthcare will double, and at the age of 85, it will quadruple. And again, that comes back to my slide earlier, talking about it's all very well looking at the over 60s, but there's a very big difference between people who are over 60 and versus over 80, and what that will mean in terms of their consumption and needs and wants and desires. I also come back to the fact that it's an economic and political challenge, both in terms of affordability, but whilst there are, the US is pointed to, does have a large private health insurance market. If you look globally, about 70% of healthcare spending is funded by government. And so it's not as straightforward just to say, spending is going to inevitably go higher. We have to do something about that. And one of the things that I'm excited about, both from my longevity fund but also my health fund perspective, is the delivery of care more efficiently, and how technology will help in that regard. So by the 2030s, and this was based off a McKinsey study, the over 60s are going to account for about 16% of the population, but they're forecast to account for over half of consumption growth over the next 10 years. And for sure, a portion of that, approximately a third, will go on healthcare, but 2/3 will go on everything else. And it's that everything else that is interesting and creates opportunities. And so I'm going to talk to you now a little bit about where I look at, from my longevity strategy, the 4 sort of areas I look to try and invest. Again, when we talk about evolving economy, it's not meant to be revolutionary. These in some way are a little bit obvious, but they're obvious in terms of their duration and opportunity in terms of sustainable growth that can come from these different buckets. So wellness is really important. We want to think about whole of life, not just the end of life, which is typically what gets associated with longevity. We've already talked about health span versus your lifespan. But it's interesting to note that the 50-plus fitness industry is already growing at about 15% per annum. You can think along very different vectors, whether it be dental care. So if you looked in the US, people over the age of 70, nearly 1 in 4 have no teeth whatsoever. If you look at vision care, 2/3 of the visually impaired are over the age of 55. If we were to look at hearing aids, that would be another aspect we could think of, but also then think more preventative along diagnostic imaging and screening, monitoring, and within that I would also place within wellness education as it relates to sort of mental well-being. The other big bucket then is the silver spending, of the silver dollar. And so this is a Euromonitor estimate. The over 60s are forecast to be a $15 trillion consumer, a $15 trillion wallet by 2020. And they are spending on a variety of different things, whether it be travel and leisure, retirement and wealth management. It could be companionship, whether that be with a partner or an animal, for example, beauty products, personal care. There's a whole variety of areas that people are looking to spend. And what's interesting is the over 55s, whether you look in the US or in the UK, they actually hold about 70 to 80% of the wealth of those countries. And yet, it may come as a surprise, if you look at advertising spend, the majority, and we're talking like 90% of advertising spend, is dedicated to people under the age of 35. So I'm not a millennial, so clearly I'm bitter and twisted that I'm not a millennial. But it is quite a surprise that for such a attractive demographic, so little attention is paid or marketed towards this group of people. And people also have these generalizations around old people being misers and they don't want to spend their money, they're very thrifty. That doesn't seem to be true in terms of some of the data that we've seen, and so I'm just showing you here. If you looked at silver surfers, as they're referred to, they're not necessarily digital natives, but they still know how to get online. They spend just as many times online conducting transactions, but on average, from the data we're showing here, they're spending about 10% more per transaction. So, they certainly have the capacity to spend, and I would argue technology, from a technology standpoint, people who are 60 or older have probably been through one of the biggest technological transformations that any human being has really been through. Just some of the marvels that we can attest to, let alone the science that we've heard about this morning. So I really think it's a little bit flimsy to say, older people aren't going to use technology. Far from it, they already are, and continue to adjust and adapt to new technology. Now, some of the spending areas, financial planning I mentioned earlier, about 52% of high net worth individuals are over the age of 55, and yet a study from HSBC Asset Management showed that only 1 in 4 retirees have actually met with a financial advisor. So a huge area and scope for improvement there. The old cliches about cruising is fully justified. So the average age of a cruise ship passenger is 48, although that has been coming down. If you look at casinos and gaming revenues, about 2/3 of gaming revenues come from the over 50s. Beauty is clearly an area of interest. People want to look younger and stay looking younger for longer, whether that be makeup, moisturizers, or more invasive in terms of dermal fillers, Botox, or plastic surgery. It may surprise you to know that I'm actually 82 years old, and so I'm a fully paid up member on the beauty parade. The other then area, and I touched on this earlier in terms of over 80s, is really confronting the realities around senior care, and there is a distinct lack of infrastructure to support what will be a growing portion of people over the age of 80. And one of the things that sort of struck a chord with me, certainly my experience with my own grandparents, was they didn't want to necessarily die in a home, they wanted to die at home. They want to be surrounded by loved ones. And so it's how do you develop the capacity to house these people? How do you provide the care workers that are going to support these people, whether it be personal care, whether it be more dedicated home health care, or even hospice care? I mean, it was a staggering fact when I saw it, and Nir's presentation actually alluded to it, but a quarter of Medicare spending in the US happens during the last year of a patient's life, which is, really quite phenomenal. So clearly this will be an area for investment, and it's also worth mentioning, as we age, the issues around mental health and dementia obviously becomes much more relevant, and we'll need more specialist care and capabilities. And so from that lens, as well as looking at infrastructure and real estate, I'm also looking obviously at the therapeutic side and the treatment bucket. And I look at it from both a drugs perspective, but also from a devices and medical solution perspective. So every 3 seconds, unfortunately, someone is diagnosed with dementia today. 20% of all dementia cases are actually being diagnosed in China. By 2050, that 500 million people over the age of 60, about 120 million of them will be over the age of 80. And there was actually some major disappointment and now major surprise news in the field of dementia. So earlier in the year, a company called Biogen, a US biotech company, had a very surprise, actually I should say, they had a disappointing announcement around one of the most advanced treatments for dementia, a drug called aducanumab. And I think the surprise really was actually its resurrection rather than its failure. And so they have subsequently, having had spent more time analysing and reviewing their data, now see actually that it may well be active and see a path potentially for it to get to market. And obviously the need is tremendously high, and the opportunity from a financial standpoint would be substantial. So clearly that is an area of interest. And really when you think about treatment, you should think about sort of 5 big buckets. There's sort of 5 diseases of aging that I think about from an investment standpoint, which are the likes of diabetes, cancer, arthritis, dementia, and then cardiovascular disease along the lines of heart attack and stroke. We're also obviously then thinking through things like regenerative medicine, as you'll have heard about here today. Not necessarily, regenerative medicine doesn't necessarily have to deal with it from a therapeutic. It can be very crude. I mentioned bodily part replacement. It doesn't necessarily have to be the actual body's part. It could be obviously a hip replacement or a shoulder replacement or a knee prosthesis of some description. So that is also areas for investment. Heart valve surgery, replacement surgery. These are all opportunities I would put into the bucket that fit into that longevity landscape. And so with that, I'll leave you with 3 abiding thoughts. One is that living to 100 will and likely become the norm. A critical part to living to 100, if we are going to live that long, if not longer, is what are we going to do with all that extra time? How realistic is it to live, that old 3-stage life model? And so education will become increasingly more important, and not just education in our formative years, but when we're grown adults and contributing to society. And then lastly, retirement, I think inevitably will have to be chosen to be later. One, because maybe we wouldn't be ready to retire at 60. I mean, I only have to look around at my own parents and how fit and active and fortunate that they are, but they're certainly more active than I remember my own grandparents who died pretty young. But physically they're more fit and capable and have the capacity and the desire and the appetite to stay contributing. And it may be that their work life is different. Maybe they work 3 days a week, maybe they volunteer for a day, maybe they're then doing their own pastimes, but they're not ready for a typical, or how we think of retirement today. And then when we do eventually retire, clearly we're going to be retiring for a longer period of time. And so how do we plan for that financially, and what kind of lifestyle do we want in our retirement? And I'll leave it there. I think bang on time.